thank you everyone to be back here. So we are going to do a session, a Q&A session with the core team. So on the left side, we have Matthias. Please a round of applause for them. I'll name them. Antoine. Vincent. Hey. Kevin. Ooh, fun. And Alan. Any question is very welcome, as here on the room or online, of course. It's mine. Yeah.
Yes, merci. Bravo pour tout ce que fait API Platform. Merci de prendre le temps. À reposer en anglais? Ah, okay.
Sinon, on répétera, c'est pas grave.
Okay, just thank you for what you do for API Platform. It's a very fantastic tool. Quick question, how do you organize your time to contribute and how to contribute to API Platform,
I don't know, did you see the conference from Jérôme earlier? No, maybe not. He was talking about his first contribution, so that's a good way to start. How do we organize our time? So for me, I'm developing open source software since so long that I just do it on an everyday basis. But for API Platform, we have the chance that Letiel, which is behind the company, sponsors us a lot and give us time to contribute and also to provide new feature, to fix bugs before in advance and things like that.
Yeah, as an example, Letiel allows me 1 day a week just to work on open source on any project, not only Symfony, not only API Platform, but at least I have 1 day on the week on my work time. So that's a great company for that.
For my part, I have kind of advantage for that. I'm working for a customer which is sponsoring API Platform. This customer is Arte, the TV channel. So they sponsorize this project for something like 40 days a year, which is around 1 day per week. So I can spend time on API Platform dedicated from Arte.
Vincent, does Arte ask for some specific features? Do they drive the roadmap, kind of, for your work on open source and API Platform?
Okay, so that was part of the deal with Arte, with the sponsorship. The deal of this sponsorship is if they have some dedicated features and they want it to be developed inside API Platform, they can ask for it, and us, as the core team, will decide the best way to do it, if it's supposed to be integrated into the core code, or to be developed in a side project or something like that. And we decide also the priority, but Arte can, as a sponsor, can also push on that to say, okay, we really need that, so that's why we sponsorize this project. They didn't ask properly to such features, but developing some softwares and libraries to Arte, I realized that sometimes they have some needs, like for example, some times ago about the sub-resources, which were a nightmare. And that's something you can see through the project and say, okay, maybe we should change API Platform for the need of the sponsor, but maybe for the best of everybody. So it wasn't a proper request, but it can help for the customer, for the sponsor.
Maybe online? No? Come on, online, wake up. One question here.
Hello, thank you for everything that happened today, basically, and congratulations for the 3.0 version. I have a question. I've been rehearsing lately on how I can use API platform with non-relational databases and everything that's kind of exotic. Think of like Neo4j, for instance. And I have seen this morning something about custom persistency or custom retrieval. And I would like to ask you whether should I be pursuing this path? Is there anything that has been done in the 3.0 version, or I'm basically on my own? Are there any interfaces I can implement to make get, post, put, batch operations easier? Or there's basically nothing and I just have to do the whole thing on myself? I don't know if it's very clear or. Then I have a tiny little question is, what are the minimum requirements for API Platform 3? That's it.
Okay, so in API Platform 2 and 3, you have basically two main interfaces to hook your custom business logic and to hook your persistent system. In API Platform 3, it's the state provider to fetch the data from your database system and return it to API platform that will serialize it, and the state processor that will give you access to an object created from the body of the HTTP request, and that you will have to persist somewhere in your persistent system. So it can be the same object, or as I've said this morning, you can create an internal object, an object dedicated to your persistent system. And that's all we have in the core part of API Platform. Then, in API Platform, we also provide bridges, integrations with popular persistence library, with Doctrine ORM, with Doctrine ODM for MongoDB, and with Elasticsearch. That's in the core. There is also some third-party popular libraries having third-party integrations. For instance, there is POM, which is a kind of data mapper specific to Postgres, and they maintain an integration with API Platform in their GitHub organization. And there is eSQL from Antoine, which is a very nice library allowing to reuse the metadata from Doctrine, but to issue custom native SQL queries instead of using DQL. All these integrations are just implementing the state provider and state processor interfaces. So that means that if you want to plug Neo4j or any other persistent system, Google Firebase, something like that, you just have to implement these two interfaces. And there is nothing custom or there is nothing specific in the core of API Platform regarding Doctrine. Doctrine will be in a standalone repository at some point in API Platform 3, maybe in API Platform 3.1 or 3.2. But Doctrine isn't a first-class citizen. It isn't. There is nothing tight in the core between Doctrine and API Platform. And so if you want to plug, let's say, Neo4j, you can just take a look at how we implemented that in the Doctrine bridge or in the MongoDB bridge or in eSQL or something like that. And all the code that can be shared between all persistence layers is in core and can be reused. And for the rest, you can, instead of issuing basically DQL or SQL queries, you can issue Neo4j queries and it should work. And if you do that, don't hesitate to propose your patch in API Platform, because we would like to have support for much more databases system. And by the way, Alan is working on support for Eloquent from Laravel, and there is a working pull request that you can find on the GitHub page. And if you want to take a look at a custom implementation using these interfaces, for instance, you can take a look to this code. It's basically implementing two interfaces. And because it's Eloquent, a lot of very complicated code, but that's not related.
You have to know also this was possible in API Platform 2, but kind of harder. Okay. And yeah, not really harder, but maybe less user, less developer friendly. I just wanted to add that when we talk about processors, we didn't name them persisters anymore because inside a processor you can persist the data, but you can also send an email. You can also, I don't know, just send an asynchronous message somewhere, etc.
If you want to implement Neo4j or something like that, be aware that we provide some infrastructure that can be shared right into the core dependency, in the core library, and it's a set of public classes, for instance, for filters, for to handle pagination, for many things that are common between all persistence layers. Basically, we provide some utilities that you can use, and you will just have to write the part which is very specific to your persistence system. So basically, the Neo4j request, and that's all.
Now, about the second question he asked, which was the requirements for API Platform 3. The answer will be given to you tomorrow morning, but I can say it anyways. It will be PHP 8.1, because we need inside attributes, we need to be able to instantiate other stuff, and Symfony 6.1. Actually, these are the only requirements.
Thanks. We have another question here.
Thank you. Thanks for the great conference so far. Looking forward to the day too. My question was regarding the choice of the default web server, Caddy. Yes, so far we have been using Nginx a lot, and I guess everybody knows Caddy is sort of a new tool for us, and would like to know what are the design choices behind it, and what are the best or better things over the Nginx. Thank you.
I will try. It's not my my strongest part, but so when we discovered Caddy, one thing that was first really interesting, and there is a talk about Caddy tomorrow, I think. Yes. One thing that was really nice is that was the configuration was less complex. So this is an advantage for our users first. Then it supports all the features Nginx supports, but even more, in which it can, it's built in Go, and it's they structured the software so that you can build other software and compile them actually in the same binary. So this is really interesting because it allows you to add many extensions in a single binary, which is your HTTP server. And when we are doing HTTP services, everything goes to that point, right? So, for example, Mercure is also built in Go and is directly built in the HTTP server. So this helps a lot because it reduces the complexity of your build system. You only have one binary and not 2 or 3 Docker files. And it also helps with performances and configuration and stuff like that. Do you want to add something about that?
A quick example of what we can achieve with the modularity of Caddy. Sylvain Cronbach, who is probably still in the room, is building an HTTP cache server, basically a something similar to Varnish, but in Go. This is a standalone library and a standalone tool. But because Caddy is very modular and because both tools are written in Go, it has been possible to integrate this tool, which is called Swain, right into the Caddy server. So that means that because we use Caddy in the API platform distribution, in API platforms 3.1 or 3.2, we will be able to provide you a setup with a web server containing an HTTP cache server, and automatically API platform will be able to store everything in cache and purge the cache when necessary. It's very harder to do with things like Nginx because you need Nginx, which is not as modular as Kadi, and so you need Varnish, and you need 2 Docker containers, and you need the proper configurations, and making that working on a Dockerized environment, especially on Kubernetes, is very hard. And if you don't use Docker, you have to redo the setup by yourself, and it's very hard to. Here you have a single binary. Everything that is low level, everything that is at the web server level is in this binary. The config is easier to manage than a Nginx config. And with this binary, you put it in a Docker container, or you just put the binary on your server without Docker, and that works. So it's easier, and it allows to add powerful and low-level features in the API platform framework. We can do that in a performant way because it's written in Go and integrated right into the web server. And in the PHP code, we just have to add some tooling which will call the Go code using basically an HTTP API or something like that.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you. We have questions online.
Yes.
At least 7, I've been told.
Do you hear me? Does the team hear me now?
Yes.
So we have one question from Didier online, which is, which version of API platform do you consider to be used for a new project starting next week?
Did you watch the conference this morning, the keynote, where we released it live? In this keynote, we talked about the distribution, and we actually upgraded API platform to the version 3 in the distribution. Why? Because the distribution is usually used for a new project, and new projects should start with the new version. You don't need all the legacy layer, and you shouldn't really use the all legacy layer to do a new project. It would be crazy. So use version 3, please.
Okay, we have another question here.
Yeah. What's the state of translations with API platform? And I know there's something that started some work started. What I want to know is it part of your main focuses for the next development times? I know you will have to fix some bugs next to the release from tomorrow, from this morning. But next, is it something you are planning to work on?
Yes. we have worked on this pair some times ago, and it will be probably available in 3.1. It's a very asked feature, so we know that, and it was almost ready. There are some things to change, to improve, and since it was compatible with API platform 2.6, we have to implement the new interfaces, and but the groundwork has been already done, so it will probably in 3.1. And it follows the specification of JSON LD, so it will be standard. What can I say? And we can, with this feature, you will have to have a translation resource together with your main resource, and you can ask for a specific local, and you can also ask all the translations. So, and you will plug whichever system you want. So, for example, if you want to use Doctrine translations, I think the bundle is called like this. You can plug it very easily with this feature. So yes.
There is one thing about translation that that was a bit blocking. So is we recommend the usage of the accept language header, and we actually maybe preferred that this would be directly in Symfony. I don't know what state is it now, but
it has been merged and it has been contributed by Grégoire. So thank you, Grégoire.
We have one non-technical question online from Thomas. So where can we buy the API swags to support the project? Great design with Webby, by the way. Don't know if Kevin knows.
I think that there is a website a shop where you can buy them, and I think you should see the link in one of our tweets, or maybe we'll see it in not much time. So they will be available online in a shop. And thank you, by the way, to Laurie, who is the designer of the Webby logo for a few years now, and who did really a great job, because we all love this small spider, right?
Okay, we have another question right here.
I'm going to apologize for this question first, but are you thinking of adding support for OpenAPI 3.1 anytime soon?
We already support OpenAPI 3.1, and we removed actually the support of OpenAPI of Swagger 2 in API Platform 3, and we now recommend the use of OpenAPI 3.1.
My apologies.
And Antoine did a standalone library, which is still in the core repository, but that we will extract at some point. So if you are using PHP, you have now a very nice builder for OpenAPI 3.1 that you can use even without the full framework.
Actually, you see how the OpenAPI specification is. And for each part of the specification, you have a PHP class representing the properties of the specification. And yeah, this part, we probably want to extract it at some point.
We just have one remaining problem with OpenAPI 3.1 support, is that by default, we are shipping Swagger UI to display the documentation. So it's the UI that you see when you start API platform. And Swagger UI is still not compatible with OpenAPI 3.1. So Antoine forked this tool and patched it. But currently, when you are using API Platform 3, you are not using the upstream version of Swagger UI. So it's something that we would like to change, because it's not convenient in terms of maintenance. So if you have some leverage on the Swagger UI team, don't hesitate. It will help us a lot.
One question online from Benoit. Is it planned that API Platform will ease or help to manage the versions of the developed API?
You mean versioning an API?
Yes.
Okay, it's a tricky one. How to say that? Basically, you shouldn't version your API. If you attended the talk of Lukáš from Cilius, you saw that even the creator of REST, Roy Fielding, discouraged to do that because it's not RESTful. If you expose a resource, this resource has an identifier, and this identifier, its URL, should not change. So versioning your API like that is usually not a very good idea. Instead of supporting that, In API platform, we support another strategy called API evolution, and it's supported for a long time now, and it's documented on the website, and basically, instead of writing a new version of your API or a new version of your endpoint, you can deprecate properties, you can deprecate endpoints or resources, and you can use the sunset HTTP header to hint the clients that this is deprecated and that will be removed at some point. We also use the deprecated fields from OpenAPI and from Hydra to document that this field or this resource is deprecated. And it's a better way to handle API versioning. GraphQL did the same choice. A good GraphQL API shouldn't be versioned. And so for the GraphQL subsystem of API platform, we don't support versioning either. That being said, if you really want to use versioning in API platform and add a V2 or V3 in the URL, there are many tricks to do that, and it's actually quite easy. And we will probably document it at some point because it's commonly asked. And it's even easier with the new metadata system that has been introduced by Antoine in API Platform 3. So maybe that we will write some documentation about how to do that, but keep in mind that it's probably a bad idea.
Hi, do you plan to natively support filter on JSON properties stored in JSON column types? For example, I got an entity with a JSON column and store some metadata, stuff like that because it's possible for the moment to implement a custom filter, but not native. Thank you.
If you mean with Doctrine ORM, the answer is no, because we don't want to add custom things on top of Doctrine ORM, and Doctrine ORM currently doesn't have support, at least DQL doesn't have support for the operators to query JSON columns in databases. So if at some point it's added in Doctrine ORM, we will provide this kind of filters, but if they don't add that natively, we will not do it. So you should see that with the Doctrine team. That being said, if you are not using Doctrine ORM, you can already very easily, especially if you are using a native SQL query, query a JSON field. And it's even easier if you use eSQL, the library from Antoine. And maybe do you want to add some words about that?
So we talked about that a little bit earlier. I created this library to use the Doctrine metadata that you have and actually create native queries, but with a bit more ease. The library is called eSQL. And in this library, I added subsystem for filters, which is a bit more complex than the one in API platform right now. And it would be really I think easier to introduce something in this system, for example, because what you do in the end is just writing native SQL. So we are kind of blocked by Doctrine here, and I would recommend to do this way.
One more question online from Thomas. Is there an up-to-date documentation for IPv3 available?
Yes.
Thanks.
So it's a good question because most of people don't notice, but if you go on the documentation core library, then you have a small select box on the top right of the page. Click there, say the latest version. And this morning we didn't have the time to do everything we need for the release, but don't worry, we will make it default soon.
Actually, I did it after the talk. So there are a lot of work to do when we do a release. It was only a small extract during the keynote. But I did a mistake, as it happens often. And by default, now it's the documentation of API Platform 3. but the documentation of API platform 2.7 and 2.6 isn't available anymore, so I will have to fix that at some point. Anyway, if the website is done or if you need to check out what was the documentation in the past, the documentation is open. It is in the API platform /docs repository on GitHub. So even when I do mistake like that, you can always find the documentation for the versions that you want to use in the GitHub repository. There are only markdown files, so you can browse it directly from the GitHub website.
Just a quick thing about this. In API platform, if you use the main branch for documentation or code, think that it's the branch we are working on. And if you want a specific branch, just pick the branch. Like for version 3, it's branch 3. For version 2.7, branch 2.7. Please.
Yeah. Congrats on the release. This morning you said that there wasn't yet any roadmap for the future, but I guess you have some things you want to see implemented. So if you have anything you want to share.
Yes, indeed, we have many asks for features, and actually. Yes, I don't know if we need to spoil too much my conference of tomorrow, but we planned lots of things in the future. For example, I don't even remember. But yeah, as he said earlier, for example, translations, eloquent, maybe also getting a step forward to support Laravel in the future. Grégoire gave a talk about batch requests, which was in French, but this is also something we could see. Many more things. I guess you feature if you want to program something. Yes, there is one thing that doesn't work right now, or it's a big word, but in the HTTP specification, they say that if you put on something that doesn't exist yet, it could be possible to, in fact, create the item. Just as you would do a post request, but instead you do a put and specify the identifier in the URI template. So this is something we also want to fix, for example, in the next 3.1 version.
And there is something that is not standard in the current version of API platform, is that when you do a put request on a resource that already exists, the resource is not entirely replaced. Actually, it works like a patch. That means that if you exclude some properties, they are kept in the database while they should be erased. The full resource should be replaced. It's something that we are struggling with for a long time because of doctrine, especially because the merge method, which is the only way to do that easily with Doctrine ORM, has been deprecated and we cannot use it anymore, and there is no replacement, so we will have to find some hack to work around that. But anyway, it will be probably the first deprecation in API Platform 3. We are already working on a patch to make this behavior standard. So again, there will be a config flag to enable the standard behavior without a breaking change, and we will probably remove using put as a patch as it's currently done in API Platform 4.
One question online from Simon. Is there a documentation to upgrade an API Platform 2 project into API Platform 3 project?
Kevin removed the documentation, so no. No, I'm just joking. And the upgrade guide?
Yes, you can only access the documentation of API Platform 3.
Il n'y a pas l'upgrade guide dedans, il est sur le site.
No, it is online because I linked to it in the blog post. Okay. So it's online. You can only use API Platform 3 because it's the only documentation that is still online.
No, joking, but there is an upgrade guide available on the documentation, and it will give you a few steps to follow to just upgrade. And you can also watch my keynote tomorrow. I will do a small recap on how to do this. Oh, something else. Last year, I was presenting the main changes, and one of them was that we introduced a command to upgrade automatically your old resources in the new resource system. It now supports properties, so the API property, attribute, and the API resource property. So you just run this command, and hopefully it writes the new attributes properly. It's done with PHP parser, so it may not work.
Thanks. Another question online, Abbas, a pretty long question. About Mercure and API platform, do you plan to have a more complex example on that part? And he explained that in his company, we had to extend the functionality custom attribute PHP 8 to make it more suitable for our needs, like private GWT generation.
We definitely need to improve this part of the documentation in API platform. I'm not sure to get the use case. This use case should be supported out of the box. Anyway, it's maybe not clear in the documentation. A previous question was, how can I contribute to API platform? A good way to get started is to contribute to the documentation, which is available online. So don't hesitate to provide patches for the documentation itself. It helps a lot. That being said, I'm pretty confident that we can do almost everything that is common with the Mercure integration of API platform, but we want Mercure to become a first-class citizen of API platform, and we want all API platform APIs to have real-time capabilities. So for sure, we will improve the integration with Mercure, and we will promote it, and we will write better documentation and probably add new features in the future.
I think I did what you were trying to do already for someone, and another way to help us is to ask l'ETL company to maybe coach you on this, and this also helps us improve the system, because if we see something that we should probably contribute, we will do it at the same time, so why not?
Just because it was an hard moment, there are also many other companies, including some sponsors of the conference, with very good API platform teams that can probably help you.
And I think for this specific problem, we have a relatively recent change, which is called Mercure options, I think, and you can even call a static method. So I think it's definitely possible.
Doctrine ORM seems to be something that slows down the API platform development a lot. Have you think of any way to work with the core team in a flawless way?
That's a tricky one. Actually, Doctrine ORM is complex and is moving quite slowly. And it is an issue both for the API platform team and the Symfony team. That being said, there is no better alternative currently. So writing a new ORM from scratch is not an option, because it's a huge amount of work and it will be not better than Doctrine. And other alternatives are not that good. So Antoine tried something. It's a tricky one. We have no solutions for this problem right now. We would like to have Doctrine moving faster and have more features, but it's not the philosophy of the Doctrine team. For instance, I think that they are pretty clear that they don't want to support things as JSON fields, and it's complicated because you need to support the query language of every DBMS. So it's one of the reasons why in API Platform 3 we made it more easy to use API Platform without Doctrine by using the processor and the providers. We will keep the Doctrine integration, and Doctrine will at least anytime soon, we don't plan to remove Doctrine, and we don't plan to recommend another ORM in place of Doctrine. But yes, I think that it will be very helpful for the whole community, the API platform community, the Symfony community, and basically the PHP community, if more people were contributing to Doctrine.
Okay. So you don't see any way to work with them or to join them even, being co-contributor or thing like that?
We work with them very frequently. We know them. We contribute to Doctrine. There is a member of the Symfony core team who is also a member of the Doctrine core team. So there are some work done together. The main problem is not the Doctrine team. The main problem is the lack of contributors. And we don't have. It's already a hard work to maintain. Symfony and API platform, and we currently don't have the workforce to work on Doctrine too.
And if I can add a small thing, just to reassure you, I think that Doctrine works great for what it does. I want to improve the filter system in API platform as well, tied to Doctrine. But for complex cases, just use your own stuff. Use SQL. It's great. It's a great language. It's great to fetch data, to work with data. So don't hesitate to just skip the Doctrine part for some things and just use your own code. It's good.
One question online from Volkan. Do you decide indeed? 1, 2, 1, 2. I start again. How do you decide between DDD and RAD on specific use cases? Do you have some main logic or rule for that?
Okay, it's a matter of taste, and basically you should almost never use domain-driven design, I think, because it's most of the time overkill for a small app, even if it's quite enjoying and we like to develop that way. But it depends. I gave a workshop with Robin about it, and in last slide, he had a document. I can't remember that document. If maybe you can help me, which asks several questions to you and your use cases, and then it's like I don't know how to say that, but depending on the answers, it tells you that if you should go to a domain-driven design pattern or not. But yeah, it really depends, and I most likely don't recommend to use it for a small thing because it introduced a lot of complexity. But that being said, you do not need to take with you all the domain-driven design tools. You just can bring the tools you like. As an example, for most of my projects, I like to use the command pattern query just because it easily represents some use cases, and it's easily, you can, it do represents well what is your business, even with we don't care about the layers, I think. But maybe other have the other thought.
Yeah, I totally agree. It depends of the use case. And that's a good reason to call Letiel to have some kind of consultancy, because this is not a question that we can, there is not a silver bullet. Sometimes it's necessary, sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's a waste of time. The general rule should be, as usual, introduce the complexity only when it's really needed.
Another question from Abbas Online. Do you plan to release a certification on API platform like Symfony does?
I can answer that. This is a work in progress. We are working on this. We had no ETA on when it's going to be available, but surely maybe in 2033 if we've got enough time to prepare them. Because obviously a certification it's like 800 questions to prepare minimum, so it's a huge time to spend. And every time there is a new thing appearing in API platform, you have to update obviously your questions. So maybe in 2023.
Anyway, in my opinion, the best certification you can get is a lot of contributions on GitHub and especially in the API platform repositories. So that's already possible.
And we have another question in the public.
Now, I read your documentation, so I hope this is not another dumb question, but do you do rate limiting on your API? Do you have that as a service?
Okay, we support rate limiting in API platform, and we do that on our API thanks to Caddy. It's probably a bad idea to implement that in PHP because you need to start a PHP process just to ensure that the rate limiting is triggered, and you will spend a lot of resources for nothing if you do that in PHP. It's too late in the flow of the process, in the processing of the request. But you can do that very easily with the Caddy server because there are modules to add this kind of features. So we usually recommend to do rate limiting at the edge, as close as possible from the end user before triggering a PHP process. That being said, there is a Symfony component to do that, and there is a third-party community bundle for API platform to add a rate limiting to your API if you need, or if you really want to add rate limiting in PHP.
One question online from Hendrik. What is the most enjoyable part of API platform to work?
Did you say the best or the worst?
TypeScript components. No, just joking.
I don't think there is an answer to that.
I have another question. So from Songtung, could we disable the response status by default in the API documentation? 201, for example, in the case of a post.
Yes, you can. There are several ways to do that. I'm thinking either adding it to the OpenAPI context inside the metadata, meaning API resource attribute or the operation attribute. Or a second way is just decorating the OpenAPI factory, which is documented online.
There is 1 minute left before ending this session, so maybe one last question.
We have some more online if you want to.
Last one online.
Take this one from Wolfgang. As sub-resources are now first-class citizens, would you design application layer commands as sub-resources using API Platform 3?
Yes. I mean, a great talk to watch first is Kevin's talk about edge-side APIs, where he talks about why sub-resources are important. And this morning he talked a bit about it. I will talk about them tomorrow again. But yeah, you can definitely design your API using this concept. And actually, we will try to not use this sub-resource word anymore, because actually a sub-resource is just another resource. So work with resources, work with complex templates, and yeah, you want to add something?
A previous question was, what's the roadmap? Is there an internal roadmap? The roadmap for the next version of API platform is basically implementing H-side APIs. So if you take a look at this slide deck, you will see what we want to implement. And if you start using sub-resources, you will be future-proof, and you will be able to leverage the new features that we will add in the next versions of API platform.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the core team. Please, last applause. It has been an awesome first day, and we are happy to meet you now in Les Salgos, not Salmom, I don't remember the name, Les Salmom, a nice bar in that direction, more or less. Which, no, this anyway, 5 minutes footstep. All right. There will be plenty of food and beers and board games. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening and see you tomorrow.